WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave here on the board.
So I thought I would run through some botany today, but I have a few other things to say. Farmers market, last farmers market this last week, indoors now. That's very good. The population was quite large. I went through to the back door to independent media where a pit is being dug for an antenna for the radio station there. I thought that was interesting. I asked about potsherds because when you dig a hole in the ground around here, you come up with some history. So yes, they threw me out some potsherds. They're little pieces of broken pottery that have survived over the years. We went seed collecting, and on the process, we encountered a train on Bradley Avenue. Bradley Avenue is a problem because the train traffic is going up. We had one train going south, another one going north, another one stored, and the train was rather interesting because it had a little yard engine on it. So we took some photographs of the yard engine. I went with Ron Sleater from Decatur, and we went up to the Pope Prairie at Rantoul, and we picked seed that was just at the right stage. Wow, we couldn't have picked a better day. Mainly asters, two types of asters, and so it's an interesting time to year to go. If you know your onions about prairie, you can pick up seed at that time, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Ron is knowledgeable in elevators, so we discussed elevators a little bit and which sort of elevators you have: wooden elevators, concrete elevators, how they're put up. So one of these days we'll have Ron to tell us a little bit more about elevator history. I would want to say something about sugar and fat and salt. This is probably a little bit of a rant, so we should say that this is the opinion of this is my opinion, but it seems that we can actually change things. If you look at women's liberation, if you look at the whole minority population, things are changing, and sometimes it changes from the bottom up. And with things like co-ops and groups that actually do things. Well, I happen to be fond of a grape that is kind of a little bit bitter, but it gets onto the shelf with regular sugar added, which makes me feel like I'm eating straw. I'm just tasting the sugar. So I look for the low sugar version. But the low sugar version is always about 50 cents higher priced than the sugar version. That's because they have a flow line up, and also sugar sells. And sugar is a deleterious thing. If you look at the medicos, more and more they're beginning to say sugar and sugar substitutes like aspirin, aspartame, and things like that sort of have a lot of influence on your carbohydrate system, and that can lead to obesity. And long ago, we needed the sugar, and we needed the salt, and we needed the fat. These were you didn't have refrigeration, so salt takes if you put salt around a bacterium, it evacuates the water out of the bacterium through osmotic pressure, and that preserves the food from fungus or bacteria. So there was a tendency in some countries to use salt, some to use sugar. But the sugar and salt content that we have today is far higher than you used in olden days. Because we've taught people how to enjoy sugar and salt. And some people, you'll see them take a plate from the restaurant and immediately sugar and salt and pepper on it without even tasting to see whether it has enough already. So people can become addicted to it. And so when you put low sugar product on the shelf at a higher price, it doesn't sell. So then some weeks later, small stores don't even hold it at all, but other stores will put a very low price on it. And that more or less says to the manager, these guys don't want to have low sugar. It's and so it's an excuse for maintaining the high sugar. But I think we can change that, folks. Go to your local co-op to get your lower sugar content food. Or fat was another one. Fat is allowed us to send butter around the world. When it took a few weeks for a ship to go from one country to another, then you could use fat. Something the same. So that's my small rant there. Okay, we're on to botany. And many people don't know their prairies. First of all, they don't know where to find them. So that's partly what we're doing with YouTube presentation is to get visual material up, to tell you where plots are. We have been pretty cautious about letting people know where plots are because they're so rare that sometimes they get decimated. And so we haven't had a map of local prairies as such. But they're there. And you don't necessarily have to go to the pristine prairie with 110 species on it. Not that you're going to get them because they're going to be spread around in little clumps here and there, and perhaps this little prairie that you go to is not going to have one of those little clumps that has a certain plant on it. But there are about 110 species, and they're here, there, and everywhere, especially along the railroad lines. What can you do to help yourself understand this rather important heritage, this genetic material that we've almost exterminated? Well, get yourself a guide that is a guide to wildflowers and plants in general. Sometimes it's very simplified. Places like in Iowa, where a little ahead of us in some of these things, have brochures that will let you put something in your pocket that you can concertina out, and it has the rough, tough information that you need to give you some ideas. The next thing you would do was take a camera and take pictures. And it doesn't matter if you don't use the pictures. What you want to do is look at the plant. And wacky-doo, the plants have all sorts of interesting things. And you get down to their leaves, their petals, their prostate nature, or we don't have smell-o-vision, but some of them actually smell different. If you have a mint family plant, you're going to smell. So these things go in your coat pocket, and it's fun to do them in the middle of summer when they're flowering, because then it's a little bit exciting because of the flower. But during the winter, they also do things that are interesting, like big blue stem will fall, and it'll fall like you had a handle of Skittles. I don't know, 9 pins. What do you call? There's a
bowling pins.
Bowling pins. Mm-hmm. Oh, not the big bowling pins. These are little ones.
Oh, the little. You seriously mean the little game Skittles, where you have the little thing that swings around and knocks little wooden pins?
No, you pick them up and pull them out. It falls just in an array. It's just kind of very typical of big blue stem. Now, if you're a gardener and you don't like that sort of thing, then it's ugly and you want to pick it up and get rid of it. But if you're in the prairie and you know that that's what big bluestem does when it gets through half the season or into winter, then there's a characteristic. The people who used to, the Native Americans who used to use big bluestem for thatching their roofs, for instance, found out that you could take this big bundle of bluestem earlier in the season when it's still standing erect and just kick it with your feet, and it breaks off at the top of the season's growth, and that made it very convenient to harvest and use as a thatch. Just these little characteristics are fun, and you find them out by taking photographs. Sometimes we have weeds, prickly lettuce, it looks like something else, or and you find out that you haven't done the right thing when you start to look it up. So that's okay. You're learning what is ragweed and what is, some of these are our own prairie weeds and insects and small mammals that you don't know. It's harder to find the small mammals and the insects, but they're there, and you can have a lot of fun with a camera. You can also straighten yourself out if you take a field trip. If you get enough knowledge to know that you know half a dozen plants, and you take some children to the prairie, very shortly you'll be asked, what is that? After you've been asked several times what that is, you'll find out what that is. And we also have little local booklets. We have a little local booklet that is just half an hour on the prairie, and it goes through Liatris and bee balm and a bundle of little photographs to give you an idea. So this just allows you to know on this particular corridor what you might expect on September day. If we had a general shot, you can say, well, there are 30 species there. Oh, and it will take you half a day to photograph that, just because there are 30 species there and all together in an ecological lump. Well, let's have a look at the families, the plant families that are involved. That helps you to understand. One of the most common families on the prairie is the grasses. They come later in the season. They're usually tall, up to 8 feet, sometimes 10 feet tall, sometimes shorter, like little bluestem on a dry site will be perhaps 2 or 3 feet tall. And they wave their wooden leg in the wind, and you can see the wind rustle across acres of grassland. And so grasses become big, and they're also food for buffalo and other animals, elks and the like. So grasses are important. Grasses are wind pollinated. They do not have petals. They have huge anthers that you can see, and those huge anthers produce pollen which blows around and cross-pollinates the grass. Sometimes they have little cobs. Sometimes we are able to take those grasses and use the seed and breed the seed to a bigger and better thing. Like corn is basically from a plant called teosinte, which had about 60 little cobs. Now it has 2 or 3 big cobs, and much more efficient in terms of providing food for humans and livestock. So the grasses that we look at are high on the horizon, high on the moisture gradient. There's little bluestem, very friendly plant. Then sort of mid-dampness is big bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Switchgrass, unlike big bluestem that falls down, it stays up over winter and provides a protection for birds that want to be around and nest early in the season. Sometimes our introduced pheasants, which are not native, but they take advantage of the prairie ecosystem, they find that they can put their eggs in a clump of switchgrass. And the clump might be a large clump because that's how grasses often grow. They find a niche and expand. Some of them have underground rhizomes, like cordgrass, which is low on the spectrum, has rhizomes. And if you're going to plant that seed and grow it from seed, it takes about 10 years to grow, which is a little bit more than your patience can stand if you're wanting to see your friendly cordgrass grow. So what we do there is we take the clones, the underground rhizomes. And most of the grasses have large amounts of rootlets. Little blue stem, for instance, may have a mile of rootlets on it, and so you can pick up little things like that. If you see an embankment and you see roots growing in there and then down and holding the embankment together, it might just be a little blue stem plant and the embankment has been cut off for a road or something, but you can see the roots. Sometimes you have to look at the stem to see where the leaf is rolled around the stems, and the little indications of how they roll over are a good identification. Otherwise, as an agrostologist, is someone who studies this sort of thing, you look at the fruiting body itself, and you get under a microscope and you dissect out the number of fruiting bodies that are on the fruiting head. And you can often tell by the number of sterile florets or the active florets. So it's a rather a science that is important to do if you're into grasses. The grasses have helped to stabilize the soil. They're often used to stabilize drainage ditches that we have all around the county. This county has about 70 miles of switchgrass, cordgrass, perhaps not so much cordgrass, but switchgrass, Indian grass, little blue stem around the drainage ditches. Some of the grasses are not quite so common. This county didn't seem to have much side oats, which is a plant that grows a little further west. And June grass is a further west plant. And there are a number of other grasses that are there. There's porcupine grass, which has the meanest of awns. I was showing David the other day. It has a very sharp seed with a sharp projectile, and it has a knee in its awn. And it has like a bimetal strip. It can bend. And when that seed goes into your fur, the knee, it prevents it from moving around. So when the bimetal strip gets moist, it grinds only in one direction. It can't come back. And that grinding sends that seed through the hide, and if you find a dead deer later and skin it, you will find those seeds picking out on the inside of the hide, and that's a mechanism for dissemination. Dissemination is various also. We pick Ceanothus, which is New Jersey tea, and it has a little explosive mechanism that sends the seed away from the parent plant. Okay, so that's Gramoniaceae. We don't need to bother you with Latin terms, but sometimes the Latin terms are very explanatory, and if you know enough about it, you will be able to recognize your plant from the family name. And remember that within the family there are all sorts of genera that are different, so it's not just one clump. And as we get into the era of genetics, we're beginning to find that we can something that might have looked similar in physical array might, in terms of its chromosomes and genes, be differently related. So some of the old Linnean definition or the botanical name for plants has had to change as people have followed the life history of how these plants sorted themselves out. And often it's just by happenstance. A mutation happened, and that happened to be in an environmental situation where it took on, and so that particular thing survived. Other accidents like that didn't survive. So a lot of it is by happenstance. We might have big ears because we need to hear like a rabbit, but we might have big ears by accident too. So it's part to do with natural mutation. The next group that is interesting and is ubiquitous is Compositae. Compositae is a composite. It means the daisy family. The composite has a stem that comes up, and on the top of it there is a head. And most of you know a sunflower, and in the center of the sunflower there are tube florets which have a seed. And if you have birds eating, they will be eating those seeds in the center. The outside ring is what you see on the smiley face. There's a ray florets, which are very friendly if you have an insect or a bee that wants to access that flower. And there are various styles of this. So a helianthus, which is a sunflower, is going to be different from liatris, which is it has bunches of these little heads up a stem. But that one is very easy to recognize, very nice to photograph, and often provides a lot of prognathous seed. We grow sunflowers for their seed, but also we eat the roots. Some of these plants have storage roots, and they are quite edible by ourselves, or if you have a hog farm, you just might let the hogs enjoy the roots of helianthus. So, but remember that this is our gene pool. This is where we get things in the future. If we have a purple gentian, then we may need that for medical purposes or whatever. If you do not serve this, and that's where we have some problem with adjacent owners digging us up for corn because all this stuff looks like weeds, then we need you folk out there to be looking at this genetic material to see that it is preserved, not just for now, but for 500 or 1,000 years' time, not just in this place, because somebody from Egypt might want to come and get our gene pool and tie it into there and make a soybean, like has happened here. We went around the world with agronomists to find soybeans, and likewise we should have people who can come from other countries to find our gene pool. And you can't always find it in East Central Illinois. Every inch is worth money. And that brings us back to that comment that I made about the salt and sugar and other things. Wealth is not necessarily, it has been in the U.S., it has been the thing that gives you credentials. If you make money, you have earned it, and you are there. But money is not the only objective. It's the common sense that's this thing. So some of this requires you to be looking at the common sense, which means that you need to leave that chemical around so we can use it in the future. We may only need it for a little while, and we may want to simulate it. And we can do that, but we need it to be around in the first place. If it's a feather and you want to use the feather to try and figure out how to allow a plane to move through the air faster, or for a ship to move through the water faster. You need the prototype so you can look at it and look at its engineering. The nature's engineering is absolutely wonderful, and we need those creatures. Okay, let's look at the next one I have here. We have compositae, and then there's an interesting one which is easy for you to follow if you're on the amateur side of things. It comes early in the season. It's liliaceae and a hyacinth. This is parallel to the liliaceae that you have in your garden. You have daffodils and all sorts of things that are characterized by having 3 sepals. They're the parts of the plant that hold up underneath the flower, and then there are 3 or 6 petals, and then there are 3 or 6 sets of anthers, and then there is a pistil or a ovary, and it's trifid, and then it has 3 loci where there are ovules. And the 3-6 thing, parallel venation, and early in the season often is an indication that you've got something in the Liliaceous family. Sometimes the families are related. There's another family called Cicerician, and it has a little thing called starry-eyed grass. And if you know that you're looking for starry-eyed grass, you get out there in spring, and it will be about 6 inches high, and a tiny little flower, not bigger than your little finger, lots of them. And if you see 1,000 of them, you'll see something white. But otherwise, you go in, and if you're going to photograph them, you get down on your stomach and get up close and photograph this little flower, which, as it gets older, gets a little bluish tinge. That's called starry-eyed grass because it looks like a grass, but it's really sort of a lily-related thing. Next one that's rather easy to find is the mint family. And the mint family, it has bee balm. We have a little prairie out here opposite WEFT, and it's characterized by the fact that the rabbits don't eat bee balm. Bee balm has a square stem, square for its physical strength, and then it is aromatic. So if you take a leaf and screw it up, it's like you're using herbs for your cooking. So it has a nice flower. It's like it has nectar down there, and it attracts bees, especially bumblebees. So when this is in season, in the middle of June, you, along with the gray-headed coneflower, yellow and purple, sometimes it's red, are really exciting. And if you walk past, the bumblebees won't be worried about you. They're after pollen and nectar, and you can almost pat them on the back because they're busy engaged in using this plant. Another one that's fairly easy to find a little later in the season is spurge. Spurge is related to the poinsettia. So whenever I say a poinsettia, I think back to spurge, which when you have 1,000 spurge plants out there on the prairie, they also have a misty white appearance. Rather wonderful. If you break the leaf, it will bleed. And this was something that it was researched for rubber, for instance. This little latex might be good for biochemicals of some nature. If you have a chemist, you try to do a chromatogram and separate all these chemicals by using solvents to move the chemicals to certain spaces, so you can see that this chemical is parallel to one that you have a standard idea of it too. So you can see perhaps 10 or 20 different chemicals in here. So a mint is easy to find and fun. Milkweeds. Milkweeds have large pods, and they do attract butterflies, including monarch butterflies, and they have been an anathema to most farmers because they get in the walkers of the harvest machinery. So many young folk of families, when we had larger families, would be put to work to cut milkweeds out of the prairie. And Asclepius is the name of the botanical name. But they're also fun because they've got the pod, and if they're on your prairie and the prairie is not next to a farm, you might want to preserve them. When you open up the pod, it has this like kapok material, and you can blow it. So we tend to leave a few milkweeds around. But once again, you've got to know that the prairie has its own weeds, and Asclepius or milkweeds can be very common, or they can be very rare. I've been to a botanical conference where a whole field trip of perhaps 200 people turned around and came back a quarter of a mile to find a Mead's milkweed. And the Mead's milkweed had about 3 leaves on it and is very, very rare. Green milkweed is the same. So not all milkweeds are the same, just like all humans are not the same. But they're there and they're fun, and little kids like to open them up. And so a little bit of our prairie should be expendable. We have roses, and the roses like dry places. So some of them are runners. You can pick them up and they'll run 18 feet and they'll be over there and over there. Some of them are standard roses that are more rare. But roses are like strawberries that are in the same family, and cinquefoil. So if you think you're in a strawberry patch and you're in the prairie, you might just be looking at a cinquefoil. Or you probably will recognize the rose because it has thorns. And if you, I've just been gouging out of my finger some of these thorns that come with prairie plants because I wasn't using the right gloves. So then there's a very important group called legumes. Legumes are proteinaceous and very good for your diet, and they don't always survive our planting them because the animal tribe knows that they are valuable. One of them is Baptisia, and Baptisia has nice little pods. They almost rattle, but by the time they get to rattle, you know that the seed inside, there's probably a hole through that little pod, and creatures have gotten in there and they've eaten the nice hard yellow seed. They have ways of eating into those seeds and getting the protein. So legumes are characterized by a pea pod or a bean pod, and you have the little seeds inside, and if you're eating them, you eat them before they get hard, or if you're eating refried beans, you're eating them after they are hard, and you're working with that. So the prairie has its legumes, and they're the sort of things we look for. If we need a new soybean, then we might have to get it as Illinois bundleweed from the prairie. So just looking at legumes is nice. And they have different ways of expressing themselves. They often have a compound leaf. That means a leaf that's divided into leaflets, often 3 leaves. And if you're going to collect clover, for instance, you're looking for a rare one that might accidentally have 4 leaves. That's very, very rare. So people do look for clover leaves. But legumes have rootlets that have on them bacteria called rhizobacteria, and these help to take the nitrogen from the air and convert it into proteins and other things in the plants. So this is sometimes these legumes can be fertilizers in a way to your prairie. But very nice. They have usually 2 fused petals underneath the pea pod, and then they have 2 wing petals, and then they have a big spade-like petal at the back, and you can recognize legumes. One of them is a tick seed. It looks just like a tick and it sticks to you. So there are all sorts of mechanisms for these creatures to move around. Let me see what I have else here. Oh, there's a Trotoscandia that comes in. Trotoscandia is commonly and it has it's a rather beautiful plant. It comes early in the spring. It seems to be able to survive against herbicides. If you see a railroad line herbicided, the Trotoscandia or spiderwort will come in. So if you're photographing early in the season or on a site that's disturbed, you probably will have spiderwort. It's spiderwort because its leaves tend to hang down a little bit like the legs of a daddy longlegs spider. And they're intriguing for botanists because they happen to have staminal hairs that you can actually put the cells under the microscope and you can see the protoplasm streaming so that you can get an understanding of the cell. And we have one WEFT member here who is a microscopist, and he sees all sorts of things we don't see with our normal eyes. We just he will take little creatures, and Mr. B will do that, and he will take people to a prairie, and they will take water from the prairie and then look at what's underneath, and it's absolutely amazing. And it's just too bad to find that these creatures have been chemicalized out of our soils. So that's why we need them. And then there comes the mustard family. The mustard family is usually an annual. It belongs to the cabbage family, and it is a crucifer. That it means it has 4 only petals, and the 4 petals look like a cross. So it's crucifery. It's the cabbage, the broccoli, but they're mustard family. And if you see a disturbed field early in the spring and it's absolutely yellow, that's likely to be a mustard. And then it's on the weedy side of things, but it's more likely to be an annual, whereas most of the prairie plants are perennials. There are some few that are annuals. We have a Canadian wild rye, which is a grass that is very much a diplomat and a nice part of the prairie, and it tends to be an annual, grows from seed, whereas most of the others grow from their roots. In wintertime they die down and they're under the ground. The small mammals like mice that are running around, meadow voles and the like, can be eating roots and shoots underneath the snow. Sometimes they're creatures that run on top of the snow, but like rabbits run on top of the snow. So you can have a prairie plant that's being eaten 4 foot off the ground because it's 4 foot of snow and the rabbit is on top. Rabbits are not my favorite in prairies because they really do decimate a prairie. I know a little prairie across the road has been somewhat decimated by a rabbit family that's been coming back year after year, and you almost have to say to people who are in the Bambi realm of trying to save creatures that deserve to be around, that if you have the creatures in overabundance, a little bit like humans are in overabundance, then you distort the ecology of the world, and at some stage you have to say, do we exterminate this creature, because we did have 50 species over there and now we've got much less, and that's kind of sad, but we have to have a good way of explaining it to others as to why we would want to eliminate that species in order to survive the plants that are there. You can always trap the species and take it away and give it to someone else who has the same problem as you have, but that's not very kind either. So cruciferous family is usually around. Where there's a disturbance, there's a little bit of stuff. Okay, now let me look at the time, and it's 44. I'd like to take you on a walk through a prairie, so that this can be an imaginary prairie. We're going to, it's a cornfield, and we're going back to prairie, and we've planted a prairie, but it's probably a bit rough, tough prairie, say 30 species, might be 60 species, might just be 10. First of all, you have to acquire some land to do this. And some people are very anxious to see that this sort of thing happens. Meadowbrook Park was a cornfield, and over the years that has been put into a prairie. And when we started out, I was involved in it early on. We planted mainly grasses because prairie is thought to be grasses. You know, they look so wonderful in the wind. But really, with Audubon help and others, and the Park District's realization, those prairies have gradually been reseeded and I was going to say refined, and that is probably the term. We've refined them by adding other broadleaf plants so they become more a general prairie. Somewhere at the outset, when you're planning an imaginary prairie, you probably need a boulder or a stone, a glacial erratic, in fact, one of these glacial stones that got transported from Canada and got dropped out in east central Illinois. You have this, people can stand on it. You might even put it on a little mound, but then you're disturbing the soil more than perhaps the prairie would like. Prairie doesn't like disturbed soil, it likes firm soil, so we've sometimes dug a little slough, so we'd have some wetland and a little mound, but that doesn't always work because the slough has it's down to the subsoil, and you've got clay and glacial till, and the prairie is going to like that because it will come back, but it'll take 10,000 years. So disturbing the soil like that is not always ideal for a prairie. So we're designing a prairie, and we have a stone so that you can look on the prairie, and perhaps you can look in the distance to the moraine. You might be on the backside of one moraine, and then in the distance there's another moraine, like the Yankee Ridge moraine. And so you know that moraine is going to be gravelly, and the soil that you're on is going to be a little on the sloppy side, especially if it hasn't been drained. So the little viewing point allows you to be there. Now, then when you go to plant it, you plant it in somewhat in clumps, because that's how prairie comes. You try to select the spot that is good for your creature, like a coneflower, purple coneflower. I didn't add with the composites that the coneflowers can have petals that go up, and some coneflowers have petals that go down. And so that's what a coneflower is. So you have yellow coneflowers and you have purple coneflowers. And The purple coneflower can do quite well on dry soil, so you might sow your coneflower on dry soil. On the other hand, if you have a cardinal flower, it likes to have its feet in water, and if you're going to, in this case, it's rare enough that you might want to have produced your cardinal flower in a greenhouse. So you're going to then plant it out, and if you plant it out, you have to plant it in a very damp place so that it will survive and its roots will feel at home with water. So we're walking along, and perhaps we have a little sampler prairie. It's always handy to have at the front end of your prairie a retinue of plants that say, "I'm a prairie." We're thinking that you might not find us out there in the crowd, so we'll have you here so that you can look around, use your booklet. We don't usually put signs on them because once you have a natural area and you have 25 million signs around, it doesn't look like a natural area again. So we tend to have the booklets and that you can put in your pocket. It's not untoward to pick a piece of prairie to check it out botanically when you get home. We have a natural history survey, and those surveys have tremendous records of the plants that we're talking about, and you can go onto the computer and you can get that sort of information. We're going to walk along here. Yeah, let's see, it's a spring, and we have an umbellifera that's out in flower. It's golden Alexander, and it looks wonderful because it grows well. It's an umbellifera. That means an umbrella with an umbrella on top and another umbrella on top, and it has a lot of character. It also has some phytotoxins in it, and if you have the temerity to pick it up, and it's in the parsnip family, and parsnip and carrots and all of these creatures can give you dermatitis if you're not very careful. So just a little care when you're handling umbelliferae, but they're rather wonderful and early in the season. Behind them there's the early growth of cordgrass. Perhaps you're near a drainage ditch where the cordgrass would find itself. But if you have a bunch of children with you, you can sit them down in the cordgrass, and suddenly the world becomes quiet. You don't hear the train going by. You don't hear the traffic. It's dense enough for them to hear themselves, or to just be quiet and hear the creatures that are there. So we walk along a little further, and we have a baptisia that we were talking about with its pods. Early in the spring it has white pea-like flowers. Well, it's a pea. And they are in a spike. And they're very attractive for florists, actually. Sometimes we've caught florists salvaging baptisia or prairie legumes just because they look very interesting, and they can be sold. But they're very much a characteristic part of the prairie. They're almost shrub-like sometimes. So they're filling different niches. Some creatures like the starry-eyed grass, which we talked about in the earlier spring, are tiny, only 6 inches high, and they're alongside pussy toes. And sometimes we don't even know whether those two creatures are associated with each other. Somebody might be producing a chemical for somebody else over here, and they get along together. So there are associations that we look for. So we're walking along and going past an area which has got some big bluestem Indian grass, not big amounts, but threads here and there that you can see. There may be a New Jersey tea plant. There may be compass plants, and the compass plants will be tall, 10 feet tall, and if it's in the end of the season, they'll be having they're composites, so they have this head of seed, and if you run through your prairie, you will bump into these and realize that this plant is a gem of drought resistance. It has a root that can be 10, 15 feet deep. It can have a root that the top of the crown is 10 inches across. The stems are harsh. If you rub them, you're going to have prickles in your hands. It has hairiness that stops the wind from getting in and drying it out. It has a structural engineering to its stem. Its leaves are engineered so the progenitors have a big leaf like a dock, like an elephant ear, but it's managed to take big portions out of the leaf, and they take stomates or breathing pores out so that it doesn't evaporate as much water. Its leaves face north and south so that the sun from the south shining on the leaf doesn't evaporate the water out of it. And that was very helpful to settlers, because settlers, we have brains where if we go 100 miles from our back door and we don't see anything but the prairie and nothing to indicate where we are, then we're back home again. So that was very unsettling to settlers. So they shortly found that compass plant has this direction, and it's mainly for drought resistance. So that's why it's called a compass plant. It has a sister that is dock, and it has another sister which is rosinweed. And that's again, the rosin indicates that you have a chemical in there that's rosinous, and that helps to maintain the quality of the drought resistance. And it is strange, it doesn't have a deep root like the compass plant. It has a fibrous root system, an extensive one, but fairly strong fibers, and not like the fine fibrous roots of a grassland plant. Another sister is cup plant, and cup plant is interesting because its leaves weld themselves around the stem, and it catches water, and you can do X number of theses on what's going on in the water. But cup plant tends to be a little on the aggressive side, and it tends to be a weed in our prairies. So if we plant cup plant, you can have a root system that is about 4 foot by 4 foot, and you need half a dozen people to lift it, and you take it to your prairie. You might in 20 years have half an acre of cup plant. So it's prolific, and then you have to learn how to manage your prairie. So we're working along, and we find clovers, purple clover, and it's a little clover that it has a wonderful flower, and it also is proteinaceous. It's a legume. And we go a little further, and perhaps we got planted cordgrass. The cordgrass tends to fall over, but it tends to have this flow. You could put a dancer in it, and you could imagine dancing to the flow of the cordgrass. It's got long grass leaves, and if you run your hand along the grass leaf in the wrong direction, you will cut your hand. So be careful about cordgrass. It's strong. But it grows over trails. If you have a little trail and you have someone who wants to mow the trail, it's very bothering because it hangs over the trail. But we don't worry about that too much. People, if they have to push their way through a little bit of cordgrass, they begin to realize what the cordgrass is about. And so we're walking further along, a patch of cornflower perhaps, and then a helianthus or a sunflower that has little veins on the side, little wings. And we're not quite sure why it has little wings, but it may be having to do something with drought resistance. But rather interesting, it's about 4 feet high, and it's quite photogenic. It might be mixed up with a legume like a tick seed, or it may be quinine. And what do we know about quinine? Quinine is used in the malaria problems. And so I would suspect that it has in its retinue a biochemical that can help with producing quinine which is used as palliative for malaria. Once again, reminding ourselves that this prairie should be around. Early in the spring in this site that I'm just imaginary going through, there's a hyacinth, and that goes back to spring and liliaceous things. We have to look at the time here. We've got 1 minute. Oh, we've gone around our ditch, our prairie, our interesting walk. And so I encourage you to do the same. You can do it on the railroad line associated with our perhaps abandoned beds or other things. Just enjoy going out to the prairie, and then you'll know that you're helping preserve the genetic material that's so valuable for us as human beings. So this has been your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM.